In 1983, a young woman by the name of Mona Mahmoud Nishad was one of 10 women executed by the state in Shiraz, Iran. Her crime? At only 17 years of age, she was conducting Sunday school classes for children. All of them were members of the Baha'i faith. Kia ora, I'm Guy Sinclair. Welcome to a very special episode of Baha'i On Air. In this episode, we will be commemorating that young girl's courage by investigating the current situation of the Baha'is in Iran, who are still facing persecution because of their religious beliefs. As many viewers will know, the fundamental principle of the Baha'i faith is unity, and the primary goal of its followers is to bring people together. Unfortunately, this message has been lost on the authorities in its homeland of Persia, now Iran. And since the faith's birth in the mid-1800s, its followers have been met with many different types of persecution, including execution. The persecution of Baha'is in Iran has gone through different phases and varied in intensity over time. In recent years, the Iranian government has implemented a new policy which seeks to deny young Baha'is a fundamental human right which we in New Zealand take for granted, the right to education. I will be talking to 3 Baha'is who were forced to leave their home and immigrate to New Zealand in order to be able to undertake a tertiary education.
Baha'is being persecuted, not having the chance to go to school, not having the chance to get a job.
We will talk to Anthony Valion from the United Nations.
Like that.
My first guest is Masood Masoudian. Welcome, Masood.
Thank you.
What brought you to New Zealand?
I came to New Zealand to go to university here to pursue higher education.
So you were 18, 19 years old, around that age?
About 20.
And you came from Iran
Yes,
originally?
I did.
It's the other side of the world from Iran. Why New Zealand?
I couldn't go to university in Iran because I'm a Baha'i, and as a Baha'i in Iran, even finishing high school was difficult. And even though I was a top student in my city, I wasn't allowed to go to university, so I couldn't really do anything else in Iran after finishing high school. I wanted to continue with my higher education, so I left Iran and then came to New Zealand and continued my education here.
Which city in Iran did you grow up?
I was brought up in Azerbaijan, north of Iran, northwest of Iran.
How did the authorities at the university in Iran know that you were a Baha'i?
Well, in Iran, there's a system of university entrance. It is a sort of countrywide examination. And to be able to even enroll in the exam, let alone sit it, you have to register for it. And the forms that you have to fill in have a section for religion. And the only religions that they have got on it is basically Islam and Christianity and Judaism. So as a Baha'i, first of all, you couldn't even tell them that your religion was a Baha'i. And even if you could, then based on the fact that you had said you were a Baha'i, they would basically not allow you to even sit the exam, let alone see what the results would be and whether you'll be able to actually go to a particular university or not.
So filling in the form, you had to choose one of those 3 religions, and
Yes.
if you didn't belong to one of those 3 religions, you couldn't fill in the form and you couldn't enroll.
I think that's the purpose of those forms, that it's really forcing people to say that these are the religions that we recognize, and if you are anything else, you are not considered as a person with rights in our eyes, basically.
And why did the Baha'is not then just choose one of those religions or tick all 3 or do something like that?
Well, first of all, it's a sort of a moral issue. If I'm a Baha'i, I'm a Baha'i. I don't want to be anything else. Not that there is anything wrong with all the other religions, but it is because that this is my religion. And the problem is that the government of Iran doesn't recognize my religion as an official religion, and that basically gives them the right in their eyes to withhold all sorts of rights that as a citizen of Iran I'm entitled to, including entering university, including higher education and all that sort of other things that as an Iranian I should be able to partake in.
So you did your primary and your secondary school in Azerbaijan?
Yes, I did my primary and intermediate and then my high school in Iran. I was allowed to go as far as the end of high school, even though in some cities that wasn't allowed either. That depended on where you lived. But where I lived, I was allowed to finish high school.
But all through that time, the authorities in those schools also knew that you were a Baha'i?
Yes, often when you are, as I said, filling any official form in Iran, you have to include your religion. And that could mean that if you are changing schools, going from one school to another school, you have to identify what religion you belong to. And as with university entrance examination, most of those forms lacked the space for me to identify myself as a Baha'i.
Were you treated any differently at those schools because you were a Baha'i?
Yes, when other students knew I was a Baha'i, I was always treated as a second-class citizen. That could have been verbal abuse by other students, that could have been not being able to benefit from things that other students could. That could mean being forced to do things that I didn't want to do or were against my religion to be part of, like going on demonstrations and things like that, that you were forced to take part in those things. Some students were okay because they weren't fanatical or anything, but those students that were fanatical, they thought that it was their right to abuse you in any shape or form that they wanted to. And often school principals or teachers, some of them were fanatical, so they didn't actually defend you, and some of them really for their own good couldn't do much for you because it would have been dangerous for them to support you, because then they could have lost their jobs or they could have been treated by authorities in a negative manner.
And so there were other Baha'is in your school or in your area and were treated in similar ways?
I actually grew up in a very small city, so most of my education was in schools that there were no other Baha'is. But in larger cities, yes, there are schools that have larger group of Baha'is, and they all get treated as a group, in a negative manner. They are all considered Baha'is, and they're all pretty much treated the same, abused and all that sort of things.
So you went through primary school and intermediate school and secondary school, and you were excelling at all those levels, and you decided naturally you wanted to go to university, and you had this difficulty of attending university because of the forms. So what did you do? Where did you decide to go?
Yeah, well, I mean, as a normal child growing up in any society, grew up envisioning things like, oh, I want to become a doctor, I want to become an architect or whatever. And that was what you worked for, that's what you studied for. And in Iran, education system is very competitive. So when I finished high school, if I was allowed to, I could have picked up the top university in Iran, the top degree in those universities in Iran, and would have achieved my aim very easily. But because that door was essentially closed for me, it felt like the life had ended for me. It felt like there was no purpose for my life. As a teenager, when you are 16, 17, that's a pretty hard thing. So you do your best to really pursue any possibility of achieving your dreams. And for me, that meant leaving Iran, leaving my family, leaving my country, which I loved. And as a teenager, going to an unknown place, an unknown society, to pursue something that I had dreamed up as I was growing up.
When you were in Iran, did you say it's New Zealand that I want to go to, or were you looking at a range of options? Or?
No, I left Iran and then United Nations, because they are aware of the condition of Baha'is in Iran. As soon as I left Iran, I was recognized as a refugee by UN High Commissioners for Refugees, and then through them we were allowed to apply to go to different countries, and New Zealand was one of those. And what I did was to look at countries where the official language was English, because I had some English education at school, and it would have been easier for me to pursue education. And when I came to New Zealand, university education was pretty much free for everyone, and there were no fees or anything like that. So I decided to come to New Zealand, and that was fortunate because, about 6 months or so after I arrived in New Zealand, I actually entered university, and I remember the first year at university, I was getting all A's for the courses that I was taking, and all my new friends, New Zealanders, were surprised. They were saying, "Oh, you've just been in the country for like 6 months or whatever, and you've started university and you're getting all these high grades." And they couldn't believe that I had dreamed about being part of an education system. So for me, that was the greatest opportunity anyone could give you. And I was going to do my best, study day and night to achieve my potential, because I felt that, in my own country, that potential was kind of withheld. I couldn't achieve it. And in New Zealand, I could do whatever I wanted to. I could achieve whatever I was capable of. And that difference between how things worked in New Zealand with its freedom and all that sort of stuff, and how things work back in my own original country, kind of caused me to do my utmost, to really work hard, because when somebody gives you an opportunity, you better use it. When you recognize that opportunity, you use it, and that's what happened.
What did you study when you came to New Zealand? Where did you study?
I studied at Massey. I went to Massey, and I did my degree and finished with my degree in computer science and mathematics, and then I did my honours year, and again I topped my honours class even in New Zealand. So I thought, oh great, maybe I should do a PhD, and so that's why I ended up. I started my PhD at Massey, did it for a couple of years, but then my supervisors actually moved to Waikato, so I moved to Waikato as well and finished at Waikato University.
So you dreamed of being a doctor in Iran and you became a doctor in New Zealand?
Yeah, a doctor of a different kind, but nevertheless, and then after finishing university, I went overseas to Denmark and did my postdoc there, and came back and started working. I've been working at Waikato for the last 8 years or so, and now I'm a senior lecturer, and life is good.
Did you come, just going back a little bit, did you come with family or did you just come
by
yourself?
No, I left New Zealand, I left Iran on my own.
So your family's remained in Iran?
Yes, all my family.
And you still have family there?
Yes.
You're in correspondence with them?
Yeah, to a limited degree, yes, I'm in communication with them.
Yeah, and they're still experiencing many of the same sorts of hardships that you experienced?
Yes, things have continued. I left Iran about 20 years ago, shortly after, a few years after the revolution. But unfortunately, the bad conditions have still continued. I have nieces and nephews and other relatives that have grown up in that time, and now they are suffering the same sort of limits that were imposed on me. They can't go to university either, even after 20 years or so.
Thanks very much, Masood. We will continue with more of our program in a moment, but now we'd like to present a talk given by Murray Smith, the Chief Executive of the National Governing Body of the Baha'is of New Zealand, who served as the Deputy Secretary General to the International Governing Body of the Baha'i Faith for 12 years. His talk gives us background to the current appalling situation, Iranian Baha'is being denied tertiary education because they are Baha'is.
So since the birth of the Baha'i faith in the mid-1800s, the Islamic clergy and the government of Persia, Iran, have refused to accept the existence of this new religion. Baha'is believe that there is one God who has sent down many different prophets and messengers, or great teachers, over the ages to educate mankind in the spiritual principles and the universal truths of creation. Among these teachers, whom Baha'is all believe in and respect and admire and revere, are Buddha, His Holiness Jesus Christ, Moses, and of course the founder of Islam, Muhammad. Unfortunately, the dominant schools of thought in Islam have promoted an interpretation of the Holy Quran that refuses to accept that there can be any prophets from God after Muhammad. This interpretation meant that members of the Baha'i faith have been branded as heretics and infidels in their own country from the moment that the faith was born in the Persian Empire in 1844. In those early days, some 20,000 followers were killed by the authorities, and Baha'u'llah, the founder of the Baha'i faith, was exiled from his homeland for nearly 40 years until his passing in Akka, which is today in Israel. In the 20th century, periodic outbursts of violence were directed against the Baha'is. But in 1979, with the establishment of the Islamic Republic, the persecution of Baha'is became an official government policy and was pursued systematically. Since 1979, more than 200 Baha'is have been executed. They've killed hundreds more have been imprisoned, and tens of thousands have been deprived of jobs, pensions, businesses, and educational opportunities. In the early 90s, facing increasing international pressure, the Iranian government changed its tack. The number of Baha'i executions and imprisonments were reduced, but a more insidious form of discrimination and persecution was begun. It is wide and deep and is based on a 1991 secret government document designed to address what they called the Baha'i question. This document outlines a more subtle but quite vicious effort to block in all aspects of life the progress and development of the Baha'i faith. Since 1991, things have been bad enough, but just a week or so ago, a new turn of developments occurred. The world has become aware of a new legislative initiative. It is a draft Islamic penal code with sinister provisions that has been presented for discussion in the Iranian parliament. The draft law makes the death penalty mandatory for apostasy from Islam. It's so-called apostasy law. It has a number of other provisions that are also completely against basic international standards of human rights. If this law is passed, it will give the Iranian government legal grounds to resort once again to the taking of the lives of Baha'is and of other citizens who choose a religion apart from Islam. We have a translation of this draft law. It gives Baha'is in New Zealand, particularly our dear Persian friends, along with our colleagues around the world, grave concern for their family members still living in Iran. The apostasy provisions obviously can be and give every appearance of being intended to be used against the Iranian Baha'is. But the world should be concerned because it may not stop there. Let me give you an example of one of the many repugnant clauses in this new draft law. It's Article 225 to 226. It defines what they call parental apostasy. Can you imagine such a thing? Parental apostasy. It states in summary, if a person has at least one Muslim parent at the time of conception, but after the age of maturity, without ever having represented or pretended to have been a Muslim, they choose the religion of the other parent, this is defined as blasphemy or parental apostasy, and it's punishable by death. One can only pause and wonder about how any country in the year 2008 can contemplate such a law. A nation that is a member of the United Nations, a nation that has signed the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and the Convention on the Rights of the Child. How can they think for 1 second about enacting such unconscionable statutes? statutes designed quite obviously to legalise and legitimise acts of the worst kind of persecution and oppression against its own citizens. There must be proud Iranians, I think, who yearn for a return to the standards of those ancient times when their nation was a leader of thought and culture and a beacon of enlightened thinking. I can only express the hope that these further descents into the realms of darkness will soon be abandoned as the nations of the world unite in their rejection of such appalling and unacceptable intentions.
Welcome back. We're here with my guests, and the next person I'd like to speak to is Lida Kosari. Welcome, Lida.
Thank you.
Perhaps you could start by telling us what brought you to New Zealand.
I left Iran over 20 years ago to pursue higher education. We, as Baha'is, we were denied education generally, but definitely higher level education was just something that we couldn't pursue back at home in Iran.
That was, you say 20 years ago, that was about the time of the revolution?
Yes. I spent around about 5 years in Iran after revolution, which was a very challenging time for Baha'is because of persecutions and all the difficulties that Baha'is suffered. And of course, as young adults and youth, that we were at high schools or intermediate schools, the next stage of our career or living was going to a higher level of education and universities and employment, and that became impossible.
Which part of Iran were you living in at the time?
I lived in northwest of Iran, in Azerbaijan as well. Yes.
All right. And around the time of the revolution, you were in intermediate school? Is that right?
I was at the intermediate school.
So you were finishing, in the 5 years that you remained in Iran, you were finishing intermediate and high school?
Yes. In 5, I had possibly 4 years of high school, which I managed to complete back at home, but with great difficulties. They weren't easy years as well. Even though we were allowed to go to high schools, some of the other Baha'is in different parts of the Iran, they didn't have that opportunity either. But it was difficult because in different ways we were persecuted, even as students there at high school. And not only me, but my friends, non-Baha'i friends who were just associating with me. They were persecuted in different ways.
For associating
with you? For just
with
associating with Baha'is.
What sorts of challenges or what sorts of persecutions did you experience?
The types of challenges, I could say it was just discrimination in a form, and finger pointing, and the fact that you are different from others and you belong to a religion that is not accepted by authorities. Of course, not everybody at school reacted that way. We had good friends that they knew about the faith, but we had the ones that they were ignorant, and the atmosphere of fear also created those problems as well. So these were types of the challenges that you were picked on by your religious teachers as well, as non-believers, as heretics, and as people of no book and no belief, and was very difficult to show to them that that wasn't the case.
Because the authorities in Iran recognize certain religions as people of the book, like Judaism and Christianity, but they don't recognize the Baha'i faith in that category.
It's true, even though Baha'is were the highest minority religion in Iran, over 300 to 350,000 back then, they weren't recognized by the government as a people of book, and that was the challenge we were facing.
Okay, so you were finishing high school at that time, and could you see it coming that you were going to be able to go to university or tertiary education?
Yes, that was very unfortunate, because we even though I was a relatively good student, and I was hoping that I will move on to universities or higher education or careers that I aspired to, the signs were there that there were no ways that Baha'is could get into education, because at that time even employment for the existing people were denied, and their lives were there in danger, and Baha'is were persecuted in many other ways. And education was just one of those things that we knew, that the idea was to create employment insecurity or some kind of vulnerability amongst the Baha'i community, and basically cut off the sort of lifeblood and kill the community one way or another. And of course, when you take away the employment and income and create those vulnerability and lack of education, fortunately that might create that kind of fear within the community.
So did other Baha'i members of your family also experience the kind of persecution you're talking about in terms of employment?
Yes. Most of the Baha'is were lost employment, and my own family, my own mother was put in prison for many years, and all our possessions were confiscated. So yes, we actually suffered quite a bit physically and emotionally.
And just because you were Baha'is?
Just because we were Baha'is.
Okay. So when you decided that you were going to leave Iran to study, how did you make that decision, or where did you decide to go?
The decision came because of the insecurity that as a young girl I experienced back there. And that was almost sort of a pushing point for the entire family to realize that it's not safe. Not only the lack of education and denial of sort of all the other human rights or civil rights for the family, but it was the issue of security. So it was easy to make that decision to leave Iran.
So your whole family decided to leave at that time?
No, I lived with a few cousins.
Okay. Cousins of your sort of age?
Yes.
Okay. Where did you go to when you left Iran?
We went to a neighboring country, Turkey, and I became a refugee there for a number of months there until we waited to find a third country to move into, and then New Zealand was the destination that I ended up coming to.
So you moved to New Zealand with your cousins as well, or did they go elsewhere?
No, we all spread it out and we went to different parts of the world.
Okay, so you came alone to New Zealand?
I came alone to New Zealand.
And you established here, and did you start working, or did you start look for education immediately?
No, my focus was education, because generally in the Baha'i faith there is very much higher value put on the education. And even in Iran, the majority of the people, the majority of the Baha'is or Baha'i groups were very highly educated. So that was the focus. And I came, and after a few months I managed with very limited English to go to university and started from there. I studied at Massey.
Okay. What did you choose to study?
I did business studies, and I finished up with a master's degree in economics so many years back. And again, a few years ago, I went back to university and I did a master's in development studies.
Wow, so you really, that was in New Zealand
That was
again.
in Victoria, yes.
What do you do now?
I work for a private tertiary education, and I'm a development manager there.
Well, thank you very much, Lida. Thanks for coming in today.
Thank you.
We'll get back to our guest a little bit later. Recently, our Baha'i On Air crew filmed Anthony Valion from the United Nations to hear his understanding of this fundamental abuse of human rights.
Here in New Zealand, we take for granted things like going to school, things like having a job when you finish school. In Iran, that doesn't always happen. The United Nations has been aware for a long time of the way that Baha'i people within Iran are unable to have the type of life, have what we here in New Zealand would take for granted as our human rights. For instance, education. The United Nations commissioned reports, sent special rapporteurs people to investigate what's happening in the country. One of those, in 1996, there were a number of recommendations that the United Nations has been encouraging the government of Iran to adopt, which includes giving the opportunity for all people in Iran, including all Baha'i children, to attend universities, to attend polytechnics, which we're aware that the attendance is being actively discouraged. If someone indicates that they're Baha'i, they're unable or often sent away from the polytechnic and the university. We think that's not what people should have to put up with. It's not what the Universal Declaration of Human Rights expounds or what the United Nations stands for. And the government of Iran is actually a signatory to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So they are obligated to make sure that all people within the country of Iran are able to go to university, to not be molested or troubled at school, and to have the education that they're entitled to as a human right.
In case you've just joined us on Baha'i On Air, in this episode we are looking at the history of the persecution of the Baha'i faith in Iran, and how in recent years the Iranian government has introduced a policy to deny young Baha'is a fundamental human right which we in New Zealand take for granted, the right to education. We will continue with more of our program in a moment, but now we'd like to present more of a talk given by Murray Smith at the Auckland Baha'i Centre. His talk gives us background to this appalling situation, Baha'i students being denied tertiary education in Iran because they are Baha'is.
I mentioned earlier the 1991 policy document. The core component of this plan has been to bar entry to tertiary institutions to the members of the Baha'i faith. We all know we are living in a world where knowledge is increasingly the key to progress for individuals who aspire to even the most humble of personal goals. In such a world, it is hard to imagine a more destructive and deleterious policy that any state could inflict upon its citizens than the denial of education. I was going to say, short of execution, it is hard to imagine a more condemnable policy, but I would have spoken too soon. Because with these menacing new developments that I've just mentioned, we now have the prospect of death for apostasy, this thing called parental apostasy, as well as the denial of rights to education for Baha'i youth in Iran. These policies of denial of education to Baha'i youth are now also being escalated to levels more worrying and more despicable than even the most afraid of the Baha'i families thought might happen. Up until now, the discrimination was being aimed to Baha'i youth at tertiary level, universities and colleges of that level. We now know for sure that it has been escalated and systematized, and the maltreatment of Baha'i students is extending down into secondary schools and the Baha'i kids at primary schools and even to kindergartens. It is nothing less than the slow suffocation of a community. Already we have more reports of specific incidents throughout the different regions of Iran than I can mention in this short talk. But the main point is that the Baha'i pupils are secretly monitored and reported upon by school officials. They are subjected to vilification by their teachers and school administrators. They are forced to listen to vile and outrageous tales about the teachings of their faith and about the moral behaviour of Baha'is. Pupils are often expelled when they identify themselves as Baha'is, when they try to defend their faith against utterly unfounded accusations, or when they respectfully attempt to correct gross misrepresentations of the faith's history in the textbooks they are forced to study. I will give just a couple of examples. The parents of a young woman who was expelled from a university preparatory school were told by the director of the Ministry of Education in Shahin Shah that according to a communique from higher authorities, Baha'i students are allowed to continue their studies only if they do not state that they are Baha'is, and as soon as they do so, they're expelled. When the Baha'is indicated that they could not remain silent when misinformation was being presented or questions arose about what their faith was in the classes that they were attending, the director asserted that even if 1,000 Baha'is arose to speak out, he would expel them all. At the beginning of the last school year, at least 50 Baha'i students were expelled or refused enrolment, in schools in various localities for having done nothing more than made reference to the faith in their classes during the previous year. 3 Baha'i children from Yazd and Isfahan were expelled from kindergarten because their religion was identified on their enrolment form. Such restrictive measures are not limited solely to devious bureaucratic schemes, but take the form of threats and intimidation against individuals as well. In a typical example, a young woman, 16 years of age, had her life threatened by someone who told her, "We will start with you and gradually get to the rest. We are a group that wants to cleanse the schools of Baha'is." The Baha'i community pleads with educators everywhere, administrators, faculty at all levels, and fellow students all over the world for their support. Please give voice, we are asking them, to your concern for the welfare of these victimised Baha'i students. Thanks a lot.
Welcome back to Baha'i On Air. In this episode, we're looking at the persecution of the Baha'is in Iran, and in particular, the denial of access to tertiary education to young Baha'is in Iran. Our next guest is Shireen. Welcome, Shireen.
Thank you.
Could you start by telling us how you came to New Zealand?
Well, we moved to New Zealand about just over 10 years ago. I was still in my last year of high school, but it was a long time before that my parents knew that my brother and I won't be able to get any tertiary education if we were still living in Iran. So it was a long time before that they decided they need to move somewhere else, but it took them a long time to be able to get passport, because that's another right that Baha'is are denied of. Now, education being so important, my parents spent years asking for passport, and so trying very hard for it, and after many years they managed to get passport as I was in my last year of high school, and we moved to New Zealand.
So same reason really as the others here today,
Definitely.
is that education was the big driver to come to New Zealand?
Yeah, absolutely.
Which part of Iran were you in?
I was from Tehran, the
So
capital.
the capital, yeah. And there were a lot of Baha'is living in Tehran at that time?
There are many Baha'is still living there, yes.
Yeah. And they all were you had peers who were experiencing similar things in terms of education?
Yeah, definitely. I'm sure everyone can come up with many stories of the persecution they've gone through.
And have many of those friends of yours also left Iran, or many of them?
Well, not everyone has the chance to leave Iran, but those who could, yes, they have left to get further education. But no, there are still many of them left back in the home country.
How was it for you growing up? I mean, that's really quite recent that you left Iran. I mean, different to our other guests, perhaps much more recent experience. When you were in primary school, intermediate, secondary school, and in such a big city, were you marked out as different as being a Baha'i?
Yes, you are different. I mean, going through primary school was probably easier, but as you get older, and especially when you get to high school, it gets more and more challenging. There are a limited number of schools you can go to. We're talking about Baha'is being denied of tertiary education, and that's absolutely true. But also at level of a primary school, there are a limited number of schools you can go to.
As a Baha'i, you mean?
As a Baha'i, not every school will accept you. You have options. You don't have many options. You have to go to the schools that they accept you, and even when they do, you go through so many challenges. Going through primary school, I had a very easy time, but as I went to high school, teachers especially, became aware of the fact that I was a Baha'i, and they do give you a hard time, yeah.
How did they become aware of that? Was there something you sort of advertised or spoke about openly, or how did they realize that you were a Baha'i?
Well, as Baha'is, we do believe in all the other religions, and so we had no problem going to religious classes. We studied Islamic books, and we were really good at it. I mean, I always got, I was at top of the class in those studies. But when you go to those classes, it's not just learning about them, they also ask you to practice. Now, being a Baha'i, you have different prayers to say, and it was nothing against saying those prayers, but we can't really practice as Muslim when we are not. So when you don't practice as Muslim, then they become aware of the fact that you're not Muslim, and then they ask you what you believe in, and we don't lie about it. We tell them what we believe in, and when they find out that you're Baha'i, yeah, I mean, different people are different. I didn't have all my teachers giving me a hard time, but there were certainly a good number of them who were not comfortable with the fact that we were Baha'is, and they give you a hard time.
And they treat you differently?
Definitely.
So when they realized that you were Baha'i, what they would ask you more questions, try to mark you out as different, or would they say anything about the Baha'i faith?
Well, they usually, yeah, try to talk about the Baha'i faith in the class, but not in a way the faith actually is. They talk about, they make stories that are not necessarily true. Then they try to let other students know that there's a Baha'i student in this class and you have to stay away from them. And they make it hard on you in the class. They want everyone to know that you're a Baha'i. On top of that, they always call you outside class. They tell you that you may not be able to stay at school. Now, being at the age, you're a teenager, you're at school, and education being so important aspect of our life, it's not really nice being called to the principal's office every few weeks hearing that you may not be able to stay in the school because you're a Baha'i.
And did that impact also on your friends? Were they sort of pressured in some ways to not associate with you?
Not really, no. I had very good friends. They didn't really mind the fact that I was Baha'i. They knew about my belief. They knew that we worship God. We worship the same God. We all think the same. It didn't really affect my friends, but there were definitely few people at this school who were quite scared of associating with us.
So you said that your parents took quite a lot of time trying to obtain a passport so that you could come overseas. What were the challenges there? Why was it so difficult for Baha'is to get passports in Iran?
Well, there are a number of rights Baha'is are denied of, and obtaining passport is one of them, or at least it used to be even harder in the past. So they simply just don't give you a passport. They ask, when you apply for passport, they ask you what your religion is, and if it's a Baha'i, then you're denied of passport. And my parents really wanted to wait to get the passport and leave the country.
So it's similar to applying to go to tertiary education. You have to list a religion, and you have a choice of certain religions to list. And
yeah, definitely. They give you options, and Baha'i faith is not one of them. There's no option as others even for us to take.
So you're forced to either tick one of those, or if you don't, then they say, what religion are you?
Well, yes, you leave it blank, and then they get back to you and they let you know that your application form is not complete, and then you explain it in writing that because I believe in the Baha'i faith, I left that question blank because Baha'i faith is not mentioned in that question, and then that's as far as it goes, then that's the end of it.
So at that time when you were sort of finishing high school and you were looking forward to tertiary education, and your parents were trying to find ways to leave Iran so that you could pursue education, what were the restrictions on tertiary education? Was it just a blanket rule, no Baha'is, or you had to tick the right box?
No, it still is. As I said, I was in my last year of high school when we came here, so I got the chance to, because you have to apply for university a year before, and in Iran you have to sit the examination for university entrance. So I got the chance to at least apply for it. But the same story, there was 4 options only. I left it blank. I still have the letter that they said, your form is incomplete. I explained to them what the problem was, and that was the end of it. So I was not even allowed to sit the examination for university. these days they let some people to sit the examination, but at the end of the day they still don't let you in the university.
And did any of those officials ever say to you, well, why don't you just lie and tick another box?
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, they tell you that, well, choose one of them. You don't really have to believe in it. You can just choose one of them. But being a Baha'i, we don't lie about our belief and our faith.
Well, such a fundamental issue of conscience would be
yeah, no one would know about it. No one would know about it. But it's we talk about truthfulness being the foundation of human virtues. So the most important thing of our life is our faith. How can we lie about it?
So you came here, and you didn't come alone to New Zealand. You came with your family?
Yes. I was very lucky to come here with my family. We also had our extended family in New Zealand. My grandparents moved to New Zealand over 25 years ago. So during those times, that's how long it took my parents to get passport to join the rest of the family. But we were really lucky to have them here. So we came, once we got passport, we came directly to New Zealand.
And how old were you at that stage?
I was 17.
You're 17, all right. So you were just finishing, did you do any high school in New Zealand at all?
Well, I hadn't finished the last year of high school. So yes, I did the last year of high school here, which was really good because I learned English here. And then the following year I went to university.
And what did you study at university?
I went to University of Auckland to begin with, and then I moved to Massey University, and I did my bachelor degree in nutrition. And then later on I moved out to public health, and at the moment I'm in my last year of PhD in public health in epidemiology.
Wonderful. So you're completing your doctorate, full-time study, or working at all?
I'm doing full-time studies, but I'm also working part-time for university.
Wow. And what's your plans going into the future?
Well, the first thing is to finish my studies, and education has been a big passion of my life. So I hope to be able to stay in that sector and be able to now help others get through their studies. But also I've been working in development work. So public health being such a broad area, there's so much you can do. I'm really hoping to finish my studies sooner so I can get actually something done.
Do you know, I mean, you left Iran 10 years ago. Has the situation improved in Iran in those years for young people wanting to study?
In terms of studies, no. Everything is very unpredictable in Iran at the moment for Baha'is. Some days they think that they have more freedom, but there are other times that they're even tortured more and persecuted more. In terms of studies, no, there hasn't been any changes. Baha'is still are not allowed to go to university. Few years ago, just a couple of years ago, they let the Baha'i students to sit the university entrance examination, which was a big news for the community, thinking that finally we have the right, we have the freedom to get tertiary education like others. But they sat the examination, and a very high percentage of them passed the exam. But by the time they had to enroll for university, once again they asked them what their religion is, and they were denied of
so the same
this
old
right
story.
again. Yeah, and the few that even they let few into university, but during the first weeks of university they identified them as Baha'is, and once again they were asked to leave.
Well, thank you very much, Shireen. Thanks for being with us today.
My pleasure.
In this episode of Baha'i On Air, we've been commemorating the appalling execution in 1983 in Iran of 17-year-old Mona Mahmoudnejad. She and 9 other Baha'i women were hung because of their religious beliefs. In 1986, some Baha'is in Canada released a music video which highlighted the heroic courage of Mona in the face of her oppressors. We'll close this program with part of that video.
She said, this is where I've got to be, a captive in the light, a love that burns so bright. This is where I've got to be. When they asked her, what could she say?